thank you all for braving the weather to come out. And we found out, of course, a few days ago that Professor Deletant was going to have competition with one Georgetown's most illustrious alumnus, one William Jefferson Clinton, who's been speaking, which, so alas. But anyway, the intrepid and the brave and the committed here, which is great. So we're delighted. This is our annual Ion Antonescu lecture, and of course, Professor Deletant is our Ion Antonescu visiting professor of Romanian studies. He's a very distinguished historian, published many books and articles on Romanian history and current Romanian issues. And as you can see, I think we're going to have a discussion today on something that's quite contemporary, in this wonderful illustration of Mr. Putin with his Pinocchio-like nose. And so the title today of your Professor Deletant's talk is Facing West with an Eye on the East, Romania's Security Challenges.
Thank you, Angela. Romania is on the margin of Europe. This simple geographical observation is heavy with significance. The territories inhabited by the Romanians have, throughout their history, been subject to forces from the east. The Romanian essayist Ion Vianu posed the question, what can deliver our country from this trap of history? His answer was, I quote, "First of all, respect for the great values of Europe, above all for the democratic institutions," end of quote. A prerequisite for that respect is security. Romania sits firmly within the strategic interests of the United States. As a member of both the European Union and as a NATO member, Romania is cemented within the Euro-Atlantic system. The country's location in southeastern Europe on Ukraine's border makes it a strategic ally for the United States. The Dniester River is some 50 miles from Odessa, the main port on the Black Sea for the Ukraine. I put up a map of Moldova there, as you can see, and some of the contested territories which you're familiar with in the area. So then, the Dniester River is 50 miles from Odessa, the main port on the Black Sea for the Ukraine. The Prut River, which marks Moldova's southern boundary, is about 200 miles from Bucharest, the capital of Romania. Between these two rivers sits another of Romania's neighbours, Moldova. Moldova is an area of competition between Russia on the one hand and the European Union and NATO on the other. In Western hands, we can say that Moldova threatens Odessa, Ukraine's major port, also used by Russia on the Black Sea. In Russian hands, Moldova threatens Bucharest. Romania and Moldova were caught up in the Russo-Turkish wars fought between the two powers from the 16th century to the 20th century. It was one of the longest series of conflicts in European history. There were 13 such conflicts between Russia and the Ottoman Turks between 1568 and World War I. In most of these conflicts, the territories of present-day Romania and Moldova were no strangers to Russian occupation. In the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 1812, the eastern half of the Principality of Moldova, then a vassal state of Turkey, was ceded to Russia and renamed Bessarabia. The union of Bessarabia with Romania was recognized at the Paris Peace Settlement in 1920. In 1940, Bessarabia was ceded by Romania to the Soviet Union following the delivery of a Soviet ultimatum and retaken by Romania in the summer of 1941 in the wake of the German-Romanian attack on the USSR. It was reconquered by the Red Army in the spring of 1944, after which most of it was incorporated into the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. I put a map up here of Romania's occupation of Transnistria, but I'd like to emphasize, you can see within the red dotted line and the Dniester River here, this is the area of present-day Transnistria. But Transnistria under Romanian occupation extended much further northwards to the River Bug here. And I've noticed in commentaries on the present crisis in the Ukraine that there is confusion between Transnistria as it's understood by the Romanians in history and what is understood today, of course, with reference to the present-day breakaway republic. Surrounded by Moldova and the Ukraine, the separatist statelet of Transnistria has had de facto independence since the Moldovan Civil War in 1992. This frozen conflict remains a key obstacle to Moldova's EU integration, a drag on the regional economy and a strain on EU-Russia relations. On the 30th of November 2011, the 5.2 conflict resolution process, which includes Moldova, Transnistria, Ukraine, Russia and the OSCE, with the United States and the EU as observers, resumed the first peace talks within the official negotiating framework in over 5 years. I've just, as you can see there, put up a breakdown of the population of Transnistria. We may posit the future of Transnistria as being similar to that of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. It is likely that Russia will not see the need to formally incorporate a region that is already de facto under its control. However, latest developments in the Ukraine make a solution to the frozen conflict even less likely in the foreseeable future. According to its constitution, Moldova is a neutral state and is therefore unable to formally join any military alliance or provide its territory for military bases of external powers. To amend the constitution would require the support of 86 members of parliament, which would be impossible for the Alliance for European Integration, that is the major party in Moldova at the moment, to achieve without the support of the Communist Party there. It is in Russia's interest to keep the status quo. In this way, it can keep Moldova out of NATO and retain its leverage over the breakaway republic. Transnistria and Russia have counted on Kiev to allow Russian imports in from Odessa, but now Ukrainian border guards are prohibiting the entry from Transnistria of those with Russian passports for fear that they may be agents provocateurs. For Russia, military operations in Moldova and Transnistria would be more complicated than in the Crimea, given the distance from the Russian mainland and the need to fly through Ukrainian or Romanian airspace to resupply troops in Transnistria. This need would be obviated should Russia control Odessa and the area of Ukraine bordering upon the northern arm of the Danube, bringing it to the frontier both of Transnistria and of Romania. And here I've given you a map of the Danube Delta, the northern arm, up here, Kilia, and the parts under Ukrainian control. And here you can see from the legend here how, according to the ICJ in The Hague, this area has also been accorded to Ukraine. That is partly because there are believed to be considerable oil deposits here on the continental shelf, especially of the Snakes Island, which Ukraine, possibly Russia, will now seek to develop. Russia's presence and potential military build-up in Transnistria, combined with its other political and economic levers, will guarantee a difficult and potentially destabilizing situation in Moldova if Chișinău is to follow through with its EU integration efforts. That said, polls suggest that the pro-Russian communists in Moldova could come to power following Moldova's general election in November, thereby sabotaging an EU deal themselves. In a communiqué issued on the 4th of April in this year, the Russian Foreign Ministry stated that the Romanian leader, that is President Traian Băsescu, accused Russia during ceremonies marking the 10th anniversary of Romania's adherence to NATO of committing aggression against Ukraine. I quote, "One can guess that behind these attacks lies the clear intention of Bucharest to ignore the true causes of the crisis in the Ukraine," end of quote. Asked to comment in a television interview with Realitate TV in Bucharest on the 13th of April 2014 on the view that President Putin and his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov regarded him as anti-Russian, President Băsescu said that they were mistaken. However, he added, he could not overlook the fact that, I quote, "In Transnistria the Russians occupy Moldovan territory, in Crimea they occupy Ukrainian territory, in Georgia they occupy Georgian territory, South Ossetia and Abkhazia," end of quote. Romanian Foreign Minister Titus Coercion said on April the 10th that Bucharest has, I quote, "concrete expectations of a redeployment and an eastward repositioning of NATO's naval, air and ground forces," end of quote. Coercion went on to say that Romania was on the front line and the Black Sea region must be a top priority for NATO and the EU, end of quote. NATO has deployed reconnaissance planes in Poland and Romania to monitor the Ukrainian crisis. Acting on a recommendation from the alliance's top military commander, US Air Force General Philip Breedlove, NATO ambassadors gave the go-ahead to the AWACS flights on the 10th of March of this year. These early warning aircraft fly from their home bases in Germany and in the UK. The aircraft fly in the airspace of member states of NATO, Poland and Romania, which of course border Ukraine. All AWACS reconnaissance flights take place solely over alliance territory. A NATO spokesman said that the decision to institute AWACS flights was, I quote, "an appropriate and responsible action in line with NATO's decision to intensify our ongoing assessment of the implications of this crisis for alliance security," end of quote. The US has already sought to reassure its allies in Europe by adding 6 additional F-15 fighter aircraft to the NATO air policy policing mission over the Baltic republics, and has dispatched 12 F-16 fighters for a training exercise in Poland. The Pentagon announced on the 22nd of April that it was sending about 600 troops from the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team to Poland, Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia in a show of support for Eastern European countries uneasy with Russian forces still lingering near the Ukraine. The US also planned to dispatch one of its warships, the USS Taylor, to the Black Sea to backfill the guided missile destroyer USS Donald Cook. Tensions flared, as you recall, on the 12th of April when Russian fighter jets, ignoring repeated radio warnings from US sailors, made multiple close-range passes near the USS Cook for nearly 90 minutes. Only a few months earlier, on the 11th of October 2013, it was announced that Romania had completed the purchase of 12 Lockheed Martin F-16s from Portugal to bolster its air defences. The aircraft package is understood to be worth some $250 million, including 9 former Portuguese Air Force aircraft and 3 former US Air Force aircraft supplied to Portugal for resale under the US Excess Defence Article Programme. When in Romanian Air Force service, the aircraft will progressively replace part of Romania's fleet of Russian-built MiG-21 aircraft. The US Chargé d'Affaires in Romania, Duane Butcher, told Romanian media on the 10th of April that Washington is currently considering a wide range of measures to consolidate trust amongst its allies. "We will defend Romania," Butcher said. Some 450 US and Romanian personnel began a joint military exercise in northwestern Romania on the 10th of April, flying US F-16 fighter jets alongside Romanian ones. The exercise aimed to enhance interoperability and readiness through combined air operations, including air-to-air, air-to-ground, and joint tactical air controller training. The credible security guarantees sought by Romania, there are a few of the photographs taken by US personnel on these exercises. The credible security guarantees sought by Romania from the US are inherent in the US-Romania security partnership. Romania will allow the US military to use an air base near the Black Sea as a key logistics hub for getting supplies and troops in and out of Afghanistan, Pentagon officials announced on the 18th of October of last year. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and Romanian Defense Minister Mircea Dusa finalized the agreement during a meeting that day at the Pentagon. Secretary Hagel highlighted this agreement as a further testament to Romania's steadfast commitment to the International and Security Assistance Force mission in Afghanistan and its commitment to regional and international security. The agreement is important to the Department of Defense because it must leave its current transit hub at Manas in Kyrgyzstan next year, since in June 2013, Kyrgyzstan's parliament voted not to renew the US lease at Manas Air Base beyond July 2014. The US military has already started the relocation process. The US will now use Mihail Cogălnicianu Air Base, which is on Romania's Black Sea coast, approximately 15 miles from downtown Constanța, Romania's largest port and second largest city. The airport has an almost 12,000-foot-meter runway, which is key for hosting large military transport and tanker aircraft. Known as Forward Operating Site MK, the site provides garrison for a large number of personnel. In 2003, the MK, or the Mihai Cogălnicianu Air Base, became one of 4 Romanian military facilities that were used by US military forces as a staging area for the invasion and ongoing counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq, operated by the 458th Air Expeditionary Group. It became one of the main operating bases of the US Army's Joint Task Force East, a rotating task force initially provided by the US 2nd Cavalry Regiment. The base is also alleged to have been one of the black sites where terrorist suspects were interrogated in the CIA's network of extraordinary rendition facilities. In respect of NATO, Romania has played an active role in promoting the values and objectives of the alliance by participating in its operations and missions. To NATO, Romania brought the largest country in southeastern Europe in terms of area and population, a fairly stable democracy, and a respected military capacity and partner for the Allied forces during the Gulf War of 1990-1991, particularly during its service as President of the UN Security Council. Romania was active in peacekeeping operations in UNAVEM in Angola, in I4 in Bosnia, in Albania, and sent 860 troops to Iraq after the invasion led by the United States in 2003. Romania began to send troops to Afghanistan in July 2002. On the 16th of September of last year, Defense Minister Dusa declared that Romania would reduce the number of its troops in the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan to about 1,000 in the first half of 2014. As a further sign of its commitment to the NATO alliance, Romania signed an agreement with the United States on the 13th of September 2011 to station a ballistic missile defense system at Deveselu, an airbase near Caracal, some 90 miles to the southwest of the capital Bucharest. The system employs the SM-3 interceptor, also referred to as the Aegis A-Shore system. The deployment to Romania is anticipated to occur in the 2015 timeframe as part of the second phase of the so-called European Phase Adaptive Approach, which is the US national contribution to a NATO missile defense architecture. The EPAA will provide protection of NATO European countries and populations and augment protection of the United States against a threat posed in the area. One may think, from what I've just said, that everything is rosy in the relations between the West and Romania. Unfortunately, that is not quite the case. The Romanian elite, unlike the Russian one, is no longer able to halt the advance of creeping democracy and the rule of law as it did until the beginning of the millennium. Yet concerns over Romania's commitment to an accountable and transparent democracy still remain. On the 11th of January of this year, US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland visited Bucharest as part of a larger European tour where she discussed security cooperation and Romania's attempts to strengthen the rule of law. US criticism of Romanian internal affairs is not a new phenomenon, and of course it's not exclusive to Romania. Ms. Nuland was the leading US official to support protests against the former government in the Ukraine. Former US Ambassador to Romania, Mark Gittenstein's thinly veiled admonitions of the conduct of the Romanian government during the constitutional crisis in summer 2012 irked many of the Romanian government supporters. At that time, Prime Minister Ponta accused President Băsescu of overstepping his powers through illegal phone tapping, use of the security services against political enemies, and pressuring prosecutors in criminal cases. The president's popularity had fallen due to his support for the austerity measures and perceptions that his appointments were guided by cronyism. Băsescu responded by calling the referendum a putsch attempt by Ponta and his supporters, who had previously been criticised for dismissing the speakers in both chambers of the Romanian parliament and the country's ombudsman. Băsescu asked the public to boycott the poll. Băsescu was suspended by Parliament in July 2012, with a referendum on his impeachment being held at the end of the month. On the day before the vote in Parliament, the government changed the referendum law to enable an impeachment referendum to be valid if a majority of voters voted in favour. Previously, the law had required at least 50% of eligible voters to vote in favour. Following criticism of his tactics from the European Union, which accused him of undermining the rule of law, Ponta accepted the ruling by the Romanian Constitutional Court to require a turnout of 50+1 to render the result of the referendum valid. 88% of those voting declared themselves in favour of the president's impeachment, while only 11% were against. However, the turnout at 46% was below the 50%+1 necessary for the vote to be valid. Nevertheless, the political turmoil did not end there. Western diplomats were so concerned that the country was teetering towards lawlessness that in August 2012, Washington sent the US Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Philip Gordon, to Bucharest, where he met with Ponta and Băsescu and warned that Romania must uphold the rule of law. Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and the European Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, also voiced serious concern. Talks which had been scheduled for September 2012 in Brussels on the Schengen area, that is Romania's bid to join the European Union's coveted visa-free zone, were postponed as a result of the crisis. Persuaded by public pressure, the Romanian Constitutional Court stated that the referendum, first of all, it brought forward its decision on the referendum, and then by a vote of 6-3, declared the referendum invalid. As a result, President Băsescu was formally reinstated as president. Upon Romania's accession to the EU on January 1st, 2007, certain weaknesses remained in the area of judicial reform and the fight against corruption that could prevent an effective application of EU laws, policies and programmes and prevent Romanians from enjoying their full rights as EU citizens. Therefore, the European Commission undertook, within the so-called Cooperation and Verification Mechanism, the CVM, to assist Romania to remedy these shortcomings and to regularly verify progress. The European Commission's latest report under the CVM mechanism was published on the 22nd of January of this year. It concluded that Romania had made progress in many areas since the previous reports. Necessary and long-awaited legislative changes have remained on track, it said, and a spirit of cooperation between judicial institutions and the Ministry of Justice is helping managerial issues to be tackled. In this sense, the situation, the report said, has benefited from the calmer, political atmosphere since spring 2013. Such progress is evidenced by a series of prosecutions of high-profile figures in public life for corruption. Of greatest notoriety was the case of the former Prime Minister Adrian Năstase, who was sentenced on the 6th of January of this year to 4 years in prison for taking bribes. This was followed by the prosecution of a group of high-profile figures in Romanian soccer, who were found guilty of money laundering and tax evasion in the transfer of players to foreign clubs, and sentenced to terms of imprisonment ranging from 3 to 6 years. On the 31st of March of this year, the former Romanian Economy Minister, Gheorghiu-Dej, was sentenced to 4 years in jail without parole for covering up the fraudulent activities of the state-run hydroelectric company, which had resulted in a $165 million loss to the Romanian Treasury. However, concerns about judicial independence remain, and there are many examples of resistance to integrity and anti-corruption measures. The rushed and transparent amendment of the Criminal Code in December last year sparked widespread concern as a challenge to the regime for tackling corruption and promoting integrity. The draft law would have given members of parliament immunity from corruption charges. In a statement issued on the 11th of December last year, the US Embassy in Bucharest declared, I quote, "The amendments to the Penal Code passed yesterday in the Chamber of Deputies would represent a step backward for Romania. It is very discouraging that these revisions were passed with no consultation, no debate, and no opportunity for judicial authorities or civil society to respond to the proposed amendments." End of quote. On the 16th of January of this year, Romania's Constitutional Court struck down this draft law, which was sent back to Parliament for further debate. The European Commission's report of the 22nd of January of this year went on to say that the important measure of key appointments shows a mixed picture, with some procedures running in an open, transparent and merit-based way, while others are open to criticism on the grounds of political interference. Overall, the picture, the report said, has consequences for the extent to which the reform process in Romania can be seen as sustainable and the positive developments deemed irreversible. The report contained a number of specific recommendations in the area of judicial independence, judicial reform, integrity, and the fight against corruption. The problem of corruption has security implications, as events in the Crimea have recently demonstrated. Corruption can threaten the internal stability of a state or damage a regional status quo. It is corruption which has hampered Romania's complete accommodation into the EU. Many Romanian politicians do not distinguish between the public and private purse. In its Corruption Perception Index for 2013, where the position 1 represents the least corrupt state, Transparency International ranked Romania 69th out of 175 countries, the third worst listing amongst EU countries behind Bulgaria and Greece. The European Commission is monitoring Romania to ensure that it meets its EU membership obligations in important areas. Opinion polls in Romania consistently show that the public regards the legal profession as institutionally corrupt. It has therefore little faith in the justice system. The lack of transparency in decision-making, in administrative incapacity, the reluctance of Romanian companies to admit foreign investors or their representatives as board members have all impinged on the country's ability to attract foreign investment. Transparency is crucial to investment in Romania's considerable energy resources, and its absence also has security implications. In late November 2012, the EU delivered a stinging criticism. The EU delivered stinging criticism of Romania's inability to access EU funds. Romania took up little more than 12% of the 20 billion euros in EU structural and cohesion funds it was eligible to receive in the budget period 2007-2013. You have the details there. Romania has to date absorbed less than 1/3 of the 4.3 billion euros, these are one-off European grants, offered for infrastructure projects. The EU has given a 2-year extension beyond the 2007-2014 budget cycle, but on condition that the absorption rate increases. Under the EU budget for 2014-2020, agreed in Brussels in February last year and capped at 960 billion euros, Romania is set to receive almost 22 billion. That is some 2 billion more than it received in the previous budget cycle. Romania's accession to the EU created a new EU border of more than 2,000 kilometers with the Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova and Serbia, for which Romania has responsibility. Romania, with the assistance of customs and police agencies in several EU member states and in the United States, has instituted tight border controls to combat drug and arms smuggling and people trafficking. Romania and Bulgaria have as yet failed to gain entry to the Schengen visa-free zone. This zone allows people to travel freely without border controls throughout most of the EU. Once they join, Romania and Bulgaria will become Schengen frontier states, responsible for controlling part of the zone's interface with the rest of the world. Further delays to the Schengen membership of both countries are expected to give the Fortress Europe climate in recession, further delays to the Schengen membership of both countries are expected given the Fortress Europe climate in the recession-hit EU. There has nevertheless been significant growth in 2012 and 2013 in the Romanian economy, driven mainly by a robust increase in industrial output and a good agricultural harvest. Romanian annual average GDP growth is estimated by the Economist Intelligence Unit to rise to 4.2% per year in 2014-2018, following a growth of 3.5% as domestic demand recovers. Another positive factor in the Romanian economy is the country's considerable domestic consumption base, with the largest consumer market in southeastern Europe. Romania has rich energy reserves of shale gas and a potentially huge find in the Neptune block in the Black Sea, which would be invaluable to its energy-starved neighbours. The risks for Romania in the event of economic restrictions within the context of tensions to Ukraine appear manageable, according to the governor of the Romanian National Bank. Considering the limited exports to Russia and Ukraine, the low degree of dependence on Russian gas, and the inexistence of direct links between financial systems. The Social Liberal Union, as you can see, passing on to the political situation. So the Social Liberal Union, the USL, the political partnership of the centre-left alliance of the Social Democratic Party and the National Union for the Progress of Romania, and the centre-right alliance of the National Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, won a resounding victory at the general election in December 2012. The President, Traian Băsescu, reappointed the SDP leader, Victor Ponta, as Prime Minister then. But serious disagreements between the SDP and the Liberal Party led to the collapse of this coalition in late February of this year and the departure of the Liberal Party from government. Conflict had erupted in mid-February over a cabinet reshuffle and the two parties' competing election strategies ahead of the May European Parliament elections and the November presidential election. Ion Antonescu, the leader of the Liberal Party, accused the Social Democratic Party of trying to marginalise his party and preparing to rule without its allies. Mr. Ponta shored up his own government with the help of the ethnic Hungarian Union of Democrats in Romania and a group of defectors from the Liberal Party. Let's just move on to that, yes. Yes, I'm covered that in that slide there. The emphasis placed by the EU and the United States on the rule of law is motivated by their concerns that members not abuse powers in such a manner as to threaten their internal stability. This policy may be described as one of equality of restraint, which we can equate with the limitation of the exercise of power, itself a premise of good government. Without it, the relations of the EU and the US with Romania will not reap the rewards of the goodwill which reside in all three polities. And Romania itself will not be honouring the aspirations of those of its citizens who sacrificed their lives in towns and cities in December 1989. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Maybe I can you put a lot of material on the table. Two questions for you. The first one is very brief. Is it correct that now that since January, Romanians can come and work in the United Kingdom without visas or?
Yes.
Yes.
It is correct, yes.
Yeah, but although they
Romanians and Bulgarians. Bulgarians, yeah.
Right. So the second question has to do with the Black Sea issues. Turkey obviously is supposed to control most of the movements, you know, in the Black Sea, according to the Montreux Convention. We saw with the annexation of Crimea and other Russian movements in that area that Turkey has kind of taken a back seat. Is the Romanian government concerned about this and about sort of rethinking how one controls access to and movements in the Black Sea?
Yeah, relations between Romania and Turkey over recent years have been very cordial. But the Romanians, I think, have allowed really their security interests to be, we might say, dominated by the US, of course, concern that Russia does not expand out of the Black Sea. And Turkey itself would like Russia to remain bottled up within the Black Sea. So I think it's really a question of the Romanians maintaining their cordial relations with Turkey, but allowing or putting more emphasis on their own links with the US, because of course they have a direct frontier with the Ukraine, and then they're concerned about especially about the possible implications of a move in the Ukraine towards Odessa, which is so close to the frontiers of Moldova.
Questions, comments?
So how optimistic are you about anti-corruption?
I'm more optimistic than I was a year ago because of the series of prosecutions that have been instituted, especially since the last CVM report in January. A new prosecutor general was appointed last year, and he seems to be very energetic in pursuing prosecutions, many of whom are of senior figures in the ruling Social Democratic Party. So I would say that Romania is certainly on the right track and is moving to address in a serious manner those concerns which still remain in the CVM reports. Yes.
Brother-in-law actually was the state prosecutor's office, state prosecutor's office, and I guess that's very interesting to say along the line. And then my real question was about like you compare with Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary and some of the other countries in the same boat. You know, it's a big issue with Ukraine and Georgia both. You know, like, do countries have to qualify to get into NATO and the EU? You have certain standards, not beat up opposition people, not shut down TV stations, not rig elections, and not be so corrupt? Or should NATO just move out and try to protect them and get them in and straighten them out? You know, that was a big issue with Ukraine and Georgia, and it was faced with Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary. And one thing people have said is that, you know, when you get widespread corruption in a system, people would single out, they lose the political battle, they can single out and attack and immediately charge with corruption. I think constitutional court judges that voted against the system were charged with corruption.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's an instinct, it's an automatic thing to do. When you lose, you charge with corruption. But as my brother-in-law was saying, you're probably right that you are on the spot here because you lost the political battle and you are being smooth. However, just so happens you are also guilty of Because of corruption. I mean, is that national?
Well,
True in Bulgaria and Hungary and the other countries?
I would have said, again, a year ago, I would agree with that assessment, but recent events have shown that the prosecutor has moved against figures who previously we would have thought would have been protected by their political allegiance from prosecution. And this is very much, I think, under pressure from both the US and, of course, the EU with the CVM mechanism. And Miss Newland, when she was in Bucharest, made it very clear in her press conference that she'd spoken about the problem of corruption, which is probably why the Prime Minister Ponta didn't meet her, because he, of course, is chairman, he's head of the ruling Social Democratic Party, and it's many figures in that party who are being targeted, I suspect probably with Ponta's acquiescence, being targeted by the new Prosecutor General.
You know that
With Hungary, not so much. I mean, Hungary there, because of the you might say, the more nationalistic tone of Fidesz and Orban, is not moving as robustly in terms of addressing corruption issues as Romania has. But having said that, overall, Hungary doesn't figure as highly in the corruption index as Romania does, highly in the negative sense, I mean. Yeah.
On the corruption issue, is there any greater intolerance among the electorate, among the public in Romania for corruption in the political system? Is there been any shift in their opinion?
Yeah, I think there has been, especially amongst young people who've become very disillusioned by the entrenched corruption. And we sense also a greater activism on the parts of young people against corruption. The fact that they came out onto the streets in the fall against this Roșia Montana development, this gold development in Transylvania. And one of the charges the protesters levied against the government in approving initially the request for the gold field to be developed was precisely corruption. They accused senior ministers of receiving backhanders from the gold corporation. So there has been, I think, a change in attitude, especially amongst younger people, towards the issue of corruption, and a sense that protesting actually can produce results. Of course, they are backed by the measures in the international arena taken by the US and the EU on this. Yes.
Thank you. I enjoyed the perspective that you shared. And I have two questions. One, do you see any prospects of the Liberal Party getting back with the alliance before the presidential election?
Not really, because I think, as you know, Călin Tăriceanu is now president of the Senate, so he's thrown his lot in with Ponta. And there has always been, under the surface, this split in the Liberal Party between Antonescu and Tăriceanu. Tăriceanu is a former Liberal Prime Minister of the government that preceded the Ponta government. So I see very little chance of that. It really illustrates my point that politicians are really in it in Romania for their own gain, unfortunately, and don't really put party interest, except where it coincides with their own, very highly. They don't place a great deal of emphasis upon it. And you see this with, if we look at the shifting allegiances within the Romanian political system since 1990, it's just mesmerizing, because people change their party allegiance so frequently. I expect you were baffled, as I often am, by all these acronyms, but I ought to point out in 1990, in the May 1990 elections, where I was an OSCE observer, there were more than 250 parties on the electoral roll, all with their different acronyms. And of course, for foreign observers like me, even though I was familiar with part of the political landscape, it was just very difficult to work out what the differences are, or whether there are any differences between the parties. Yeah.
Do you have another question?
Yeah.
I think I had several.
I did, well, you mentioned that they only took advantage of 12% of the funds that were
Available, yes.
What circumstances do you think would have better facilitated them?
Well, I think really better administrative capacity. This is one of the major problems that Romania has encountered ever since it's been in receipt of EU grants. And the fact it is difficult to gain an EU grant, I say from my own experience in trying to help academics in Romania. But that said, people are not sufficiently well trained in order to negotiate the EU application grant process. And Romania has shown generally at the administrative levels, especially at the level of local administration, a woeful lack of capacity in taking up offers of help which the EU have made in order to facilitate Romania's access to the EU structural funds. And the problem with these funds is that these are one-off grants. You know, they're not rolling grants that you can apply to within 2 years' time or 3 years' time. If you don't apply for them and get one, that's it. You know, it's not going to be offered again. It may be offered again in the next budget cycle, but it won't be offered again in that particular cycle. So we need to distinguish, as I say, between the one-off grants and the funds which are sort of on stream, which you can continually tap. Yeah, Eugene.
Has the Ukrainian crisis affected any of the narratives of the perhaps fringe elements, the nationalist elements in Romania or in Moldova? I think in Hungary there was a parliamentary teacher.
Yes.
Very kind.
Well, of course, Moldova is for most Romanians is seen as part of Romania anyway. Moldova is a sort of fabricated state, and there is no such thing as the Moldovan language. It's Romanian, which is true. I mean, you only got to compare the two, and they're virtually identical, apart from some lexical differences. But there's always been this strong nostalgic link between the two territories, and certainly that link has been, we might say, augmented by what has happened recently in the Ukraine. The other aspect is I think in the Western media, it's not fully appreciated that within, say, Transnistria itself, the breakaway region, several of the major oligarchs there are not Russian, they're Ukrainians. And they have their own interest in preserving links with Russians because of the financial benefit it brings. So to see the Ukrainians solely as the victims, I'm expressing a Romanian point of view now, in respect of Transnistria, is not accurate, because Romanians certainly don't regard the Ukrainians as, we can say, holier than thou. I mean, another example of that is legislation passed by Kiev after the overthrow of Yanukovych in Chernovtsi, which is former Northern Bukovina, banning the use of Romanian locally, and now a significant proportion of the population in Northern Bukovina is Romanian speaking. Not majority, but a significant portion. So that antagonized many Romanians. Yes.
Better go use the door. 160 or 260 people.
About 250, I seem to remember, yes.
Some are quite tiny.
Yeah.
Band.
Yeah, well, band's a good word, because there are about 5 gypsy parties, I remember, or Roma parties. And one of the things I was asked to do as an observer was to follow Roma participation in the elections, which was extremely rewarding for me personally, because I got to meet so many Roma mayors in the south of Romania. I went around and talked to them, and I remember one memorable conversation I had with one mayor of a town or a large village not far from Bucharest. When I went there, I saw posters for the Social Democratic Party, which is the former Communist Party, everywhere. And yet this was a Roma village, and there were no posters for the Romanian Roma parties, no electoral propaganda. So I asked the mayor, what's happened to Roma representation in your village? After all, there are these 4 or 5 Roma parties, not a single electoral poster. And he replied to me quite straight-faced, they don't pay enough money.
I assume this must lead to all sorts of block forming.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and local interests and
Effect or not to effect.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I think though the Social Democratic Party has promoted Roma interests where it can, and I found, certainly talking to individual Romas, not the mayor, but when we talked over a drink generally, they were, I think, genuinely grateful to the Social Democratic Party for helping them with various projects, especially on the welfare front, because unemployment and poverty are two major problems which affect the Roma communities in some areas of Romania.
More in that area than in winning elections.
Yeah, I would say do, yes. I mean, of course, the two are linked because if you have, the Roma community is probably some 2.5 million in Romania. The Romanian census figures underestimate the number of Romas for various reasons, which I won't go into here. But there are probably about 2.4 million Romas, and you can think they represent a very important element in the electorate, because large numbers of them, I found, did vote in their villages. So if they were voting for the Social Democratic Party, and if they voted, it was very likely that the Social Democratic Party would get in their village, town, county, and indeed this happened. So I found the Social Democratic Party placing more emphasis on Roma interests than, say, the Liberal Party did, or the other Social Democratic Party in Romania, which is in 1990 they were all one, but then they later divided in 1991.
Comments? Please join me in thanking Professor Deletant for a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much.
Right.